Welcome to Development Talks at South South News. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, such as eliminating abject poverty and promoting sustainable development? What is one UN agency, namely DESA, the Department for Economic and Social Affairs, doing to help achieve these goals and many others? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on this very important agency. My guest today is Mr. Thomas Gass. Mr. Thomas Gass is the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs in the UN DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Mr. Gass has extensive experience in development cooperation, both in the field and in headquarters, in bilateral and in multilateral agencies. Before joining the United Nations, he served as Ambassador of Switzerland to Nepal, which included the responsibility for a $20 to $30 million development program. Mr. Thomas Gass, welcome to South South News.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. It's a great pleasure to be here today.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's start off with just a very brief overview. We could spend an hour or two on DESA. What is DESA's mission, more or less?
Basically, it's the entity within the United Nations Secretariat that deals with economic, social, and environmental affairs. So it basically provides the secretarial services to the norm setting, this activity of the United Nations member states where they get together and agree on common policies, on common norms to move forward in the area of economic, social, and development.
Exactly, a very important area. We've heard over the last really almost 15 years now about the Millennium Development Goals, the 8 goals to reduce abject poverty, to empower women, to promote universal primary school education. Those goals are going to expire in 2015. There's going to be a whole new development agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals. Give us a little overview of where the MDGs are going into the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll mention a few of them as we go along.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are actually at a watershed moment. And not just in terms of what the UN is discussing, but also its implications for development cooperation. As you said, we are arriving at the end of these first 15 years of the millennium, where we had set ourselves the objectives of reducing poverty by half, basically. That's what these 8 Millennium Development Goals were all about. They were basically a kind of a log frame, a kind of a strategy of how to deal with the highest priorities related to poverty in the South, in the developing countries, basically. Now, as we prepare this next agenda, the one that will start in January 2016, the member states of the UN wanted it differently, wanted to be able to determine this agenda themselves. So it wasn't going to be some experts sitting in a room deciding what is good for the countries, for the developing countries, but much rather the member states, all 193 of them, discussing together on what would be their common vision for 2030. So we have something completely different from what we had over the last 15 years.
Exactly. And now, as I understand it, there are 17 new goals and 169 targets that'll be under those 17 goals. We're going to get into the goals in a minute, but what are some of the basic differences? I know there's a larger number, but quantitatively and qualitatively, what are some of the differences between the old 8 Millennium Development Goals and the new Sustainable Development Goals?
I think it's important to say that we are not just throwing the old Millennium Development Goals overboard. It's very clear to everyone that these have to be reached. There's an unfinished business there that has to be done. But these new goals, they aim at eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. So we're no longer satisfied with halving. We want to eradicate poverty. Another important difference is that there is a much stronger integration of social, environmental, and economic aspects in each of those 17 goals and 169 targets, as you said. But if I had to say which is the most important difference, it is this concept of leaving no one behind, which is firmly rooted in our understanding of human rights. And that basically shifts the paradigm altogether. Because these new goals and targets are all formulated in a way of, everybody should have access. All should have access to water. All should have access to food and education, etc. So, a somewhat absolute objective. Now, what that means is that equality becomes very important, and the fighting against inequality. So we can't have even not just between countries, but also within countries. We can't have pockets of abject poverty, and get away with it. The other big difference is we can't hide behind averages anymore. You see, previously during the MDGs, we fared relatively well. But why? Because China and India had this very strong growth. And so it pulled up the averages. When we say that no one can be left behind, we can't hide behind averages anymore. We have to start by identifying the most vulnerable communities, the most vulnerable population. We have to identify the risks. We have to strengthen the resilience. Otherwise, we'll never get there. And that means a new way of looking at development cooperation, a new link between humanitarian aid and development cooperation. In the past, countries were kind of divided. You had the development countries that were kind of the turf of the development agencies, and then those that were kind of humanitarian cases. This is different now. We cannot reach these sustainable development goals if we don't start with the most vulnerable groups.
Exactly. Now, I've heard some people comment that before there were 8 goals, which really galvanized the world to a large degree. A lot of the non-governmental organizations, private sectors, folks, the United Nations agencies, but some folks have commented that 17 goals with 169 targets, which is basically 10 targets per goal, may be overly ambitious. How do you view that? Do you think that it's doable, it's manageable, and it will bring people in to work on these goals, that they will focus on the ones that are of interest to them?
Well, I'm hoping, as one that is engaged in this now, I'm hoping that in September, when the heads of state come here to Turtle Bay and agree on this new agenda, that it's not going to be an agreement among them, but it's going to be a commitment towards their people. Now, the needs of humanity are complex. They can't be easily summarized and easily reduced. And therefore, although I agree that it's difficult to communicate such a large number of goals and targets, actually that represents the diversity and the complexity of humanity. And perhaps the objective wasn't so much, this is an agenda that is emerging. It's not an agenda that is all finished yet. This year is still going to be major negotiations, but it's an agenda that perhaps is not meant to dictate to countries what their priorities should be, but much more where they have to reach within the next 15 years, and then leave it to those countries to actually decide, how best to reach how best to achieve this joint agreed vision.
These 17 goals are very, very important, and I'm sure it's hard to prioritize them, but would you think, and I'm just throwing these out, you may disagree, but would you think that maybe climate change, elimination of poverty, and perhaps empowering women would be perhaps 3 of the most important, if just by a slight margin above the others, or are they all of equal importance?
Well, I work in the Secretariat. The decisions are actually taken by the member states in this institution, and therefore it's very important that I don't, let's say, preempt or second guess what member states will decide. Now, in July of last year, the open working group that had to work over nearly 2 years on these sustainable development goals came up with this set of 17 and 169 targets, emphasizing that there wasn't one more important than another. And I think that we need to respect that, unless the member states decide otherwise. Now, in a recently released report, the Secretary General report about the road to dignity for all by 2030, which is a synthesis report basically of this process. The Secretary General proposed a set of 6 essential elements that could summarize this this agenda. Basically, speaking of the people, of the dignity, of justice, of the basic needs, etc. I mean, of the importance of a partnership that underpins this new agenda. So there are probably ways of communicating the agenda in a more streamlined fashion. But I think we should be careful and guard ourselves against thinking that it's easy to simplify a joint agreed vision of humanity for the next 15 years.
Exactly. And I think by having, my own personal opinion, by having 17 goals and 169 targets, you will find different groups that will align themselves to work on those goals and those targets.
Precisely.
All 169 may not be of interest to Rotary International or Kiwanis International, but perhaps 15 or 20 of them very well may be and tie into their agenda. So
yes.
There's opportunity to involve many different groups and many types of expertise and resources in this. I'm glad you mentioned the road to dignity. I'm so glad you mentioned those 6 points. Let's discuss them very briefly. The first one is dignity. What did the Secretary General mean by dignity? And we'll go through them very briefly.
It's basically the alleviation of poverty, the eradication of extreme poverty, and the fight against inequalities.
And number 2 is prosperity, which ties right into dignity.
This is like a test now.
I've got the answers.
The prosperity is about inclusive economies, making sure that economies grow. I mean, this is essential, but that they grow for everyone and not just for the elite.
Mm-hmm. Did you factor in also, I'm sure you probably did, this inequity that exists, especially in countries like the United States now, this huge chasm between a small number of people, 1%, 2%, that have a large accumulation of wealth and the 98% that do not have a very large accumulation of wealth. But did you look at that, the economic chasm that exists in the U.S. and many countries in Latin America and other places?
Well, interestingly, this has become a very strong theme over the last 2-3 years in the UN, but also globally. I mean, you had very important scholars like Thomas Piketty coming out with an analysis of new data on this. But at the same time, this has become a theme, in my opinion, that rallies countries across the board. You know, previously, when you were speaking about fighting poverty and economic issues, generally there was always a strong divide in the UN between those who have and those who and who fear that they may have to give, you know, or more than they are willing to, and those countries that feel that they should receive, you know, in this partnerships of solidarity. Now, this theme of inequality is coming across that, where actually countries like Brazil and other Latin American countries are all of a sudden saying, this is our challenge, you know, and major countries, even in Europe, that are recognizing that this is their challenge. And so it has become one of those 17 goals, and is something which will be very prominent, hopefully, in this post-2015 agenda. It is seen that inequality is actually a driver of injustice, you know, and of insecurity. And therefore, that is different from the past. In the past, we always thought that if the elite was receiving sufficient funds, there would be a trickle-down effects to the masses. I think that there is a certain questioning of that hypothesis now.
Exactly, and of course that leads into the whole situation too it leads to political instability, which can be detrimental for everyone, or even you could even take it even a few steps further into terrorism. That we won't go into that right now. Let's talk about point number 3, justice. What was meant by justice?
Well, justice is actually, as far as we can go towards those themes that you've just mentioned, peace, security, good governance is of course important for development, for sustainable development. Now those are themes which within the UN are dealt with mostly in other areas, for example in the Security Council. And some member states want to keep the mandate of the Security Council quite distinct from that of the economic and social sphere. However, it's understood and it's accepted that justice, that good governance are absolutely key, that they're a foundation of peace and security, and that this in turn is essential for sustainable development.
And point number 4 is people.
Yes.
All 7.2 billion of us.
Yes, yes.
What did the Secretary General have in mind on that?
The importance is also here to make sure that there's gender equity, that women are empowered, and that there is that the people, that the development is people centered in a sense. Yeah. Sustainable development classically is this integration of economic, social, environmental. So this is making sure that the ecosystems are still there and can serve, not just all the people on the earth. We don't want ecosystems only just for the rich countries, but we want ecosystems for all, but also for future generations. So this is an element of making sure the planet can continue to serve our purposes also in the future and those of our children.
Exactly. And the last point deals with partnership, and what did he have in mind on that?
Partnerships is basically the means of implementation. And there is this recognition that solidarity will continue to be a very, very important element of the agenda going forward. Not all countries have the same endowment, not all countries have the same responsibilities, not all countries can do the same, and therefore everyone is called to be able to step to the plate to the best possible extent, but not just governments. There is a strong recognition now also that all forms of funding and financing need to be unlocked, and that the way the private sector is doing its business makes a big difference. It's not just what they do, what the private sector does with its extra money, with a philanthropy. It's much more, how does it make its money? And are those jobs decent? Are people employed in ways that allow them to come out of extreme poverty and to build up livelihoods that are dignified?
Mm-hmm. And of course, that will take the cooperation of governments, the private sector, the United Nations, just basically everyone in the society to make sure that that happens. What has been the reception so far? I know you deal primarily with the United Nations, the various member states, the 193 countries of the UN General Assembly, but has there been a lot of enthusiasm for the new Sustainable Development Goals, that both in the public and private areas? Yes,
I would say that the process that led to these 17 goals and has mobilized a lot of interest by civil society, by the governments, by the private sector, but it's still not enough. When we started the Millennium Development Goals, it took us nearly 5 years until people started talking about it.
That's right.
Now, we have some advance because the summit is only in September and we are already talking about it. But really, we still need to do much, much more to get everyone onto the starting line, so that we can all, start running come 1st of January 2016.
Now, with the summit in September, will this be the major rollout? This will be the final product? This will be where you unveil it to the world and everybody starts focusing on them?
Yes, as I said, I hope that it will be the moment when the heads of state and heads of government commit to their people that this is what they want to achieve within the next 15 years. Now, it so happens that it's the 70th anniversary of the UN. So it's a great time. It's a great milestone. But I also hope that this agreement, that this agenda, in a sense, is some way commensurate to what the founders of the UN did 70 years ago, and sets us on a road with as much energy as those people did then.
Exactly. Now, what do you see as some of the challenges between now and September? Are things moving along very nicely, or are there some other challenges you'll have between now and then?
Well, there are plenty of challenges.
Always.
Because there are very different interests, between member states, within member states. I would say one of the big challenges is, of course, this question of mobilizing the means of implementation and getting governments in a post-crisis, phase to actually commit to ambitious funding, but also not just money in terms of numbers, but also a recognition that more needs to be done in trade facilitation, in providing access to least developed countries, for example, to the products from those countries to the markets in the north, without duties and without quotas, providing access to developing countries for essential medicines, for new technology. I mean, those were already in the MDGs. Those ideas were there, but much more needs to be done in those areas. And so we really hope that this year, and there's an important conference that is going to be held in Addis Ababa in July 2015, that this conference will bring together this ambition. And then of course there's the rendezvous around climate change in Paris at the end of the year, which is also part of this package. The Secretary General always says that climate change and sustainable development are two sides of the same coin, and you can't really dissociate them. The climate change is an important element of these sustainable development goals, and you cannot have a good mitigation of climate change, a good adaptation to climate change, if you don't have sustainable development, and vice versa.
Exactly. And if our viewers would like more information on this, they can go to www.desa.org. They could Google Sustainable Development Goals. There are many, many sources of getting more information on this. But Mr. Thomas Goss with the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege for me to be here.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on Development Talks at South South News.